All right, so it's my pleasure to introduce Kilian Weinberger, who will be speaking on the cost of calibration. Kilian is a leader in the field. He's contributed to many areas, including metric learning, kernel learning, and most recently deep learning and computer vision, where he's one of the creators of the DenseNet, which has won several benchmarks. He did his PhD with Lawrence Saul at the University of Pennsylvania, after which he was in industry for a little while, Yahoo, and then moved to the Washington University in St. Louis, and he's now presently faculty at Cornell University, where I know him as a good-spirited and wonderfully generous colleague. So I'm really looking forward to Kilian's talk.
Thank you. All right, so, I'm loud. I'm talking about calibration of classifiers. And so before I start, let me introduce a little scenario. So, imagine, I go to a doctor, right, this is me on the right, and I say, Doc, I'm not feeling very well, I have the following symptoms, and the doctor now says, okay, let me run your data through this machine learning algorithm and see if you have a certain disease, right? That's a scenario that hopefully will be quite common in the not too distant future. And it's essentially a scenario where, in the essence, basically we have a decision maker, which is the doctor, and she makes a decision about me, the patient, and it's quite important, to me at least, what decision she makes. So the stakes are high, and she reads out the prediction of some machine learning algorithm, so she interacts with some machine. And what I will focus on in this talk is this interaction between the specialist who makes an important decision and the algorithm that basically has some risk assessment. And then actually, if you just listen to the talk we just saw, this machine learning challenge, right, that's exactly the same setting where people debate whether they should give someone a loan or a credit card, right? That's exactly the same setting. You have some risk assessment tool that tries to predict what's the probability of not defaulting, and then the expert will make a decision that's very, very important to the individual. So in my talk, I hope to convince you of two things. So the first point I'm making is that actually calibration is achievable, especially in deep neural networks. So that's the good news. And then comes the second part of the talk, which is not so good news, that calibration in deep neural networks has unintended or undesirable side effects. Let me start with the big picture and the good news. So the setup is as follows. We have some inputs, and so the doctor basically runs this risk assessment tool. And so on the left-hand side, you basically see all these, here are my, was there a person? Oh no. We have our input data points, we run them through the classifier, and out of the classifier come predictions. Now each patient, either basically is a 1 or a 0, right? So you either have the disease or you don't, or you will default in the future or you won't, right? That's the true label. But of course, it's not as easy as that, right? So there's uncertainty. So what the tool does, it outputs a number, which is a probability. And the probability is supposed to mean this is the probability of the person being positive. And I claim in some sense the minimum, right? The minimum requirement for this classifier to be interpretable is that probability, that output of the classifier is actually truthful. So that means when the classifier predicts a 0.6 probability of the person defaulting or having a certain disease, then really that is the case. That basically 60% of those people actually are positive and 40% are negative. For each individual, you can't tell if that's the case because each individual is either positive or negative. But if you look at a population, sample population, then you can tell. So let me just show this. So for example, what we could do, we could run a whole bunch of patients through our algorithm, bin them. So for example, here we take the bin of all the people that get a probability of 0.7 of being positive. And then we look at how many of them are actually positive, and then we would expect that a well-calibrated classifier should match that. So in reality, if it says 70% are positive, there should really be 70% positive. Of course, it's not just for one bin, it's for every bin. So basically, essentially, you have to take your data and bin it up in various ways. And then you can analyze a classifier, how well calibrated it is. So in this case, I made 3 bins. So the classifier basically puts people either in 0.5, in 0.7, and 0.9. And in order to be calibrated, I expect that, for example, in bin C, really 90% are positive, in bin A, 50% are positive, and bin B, 70% are positive. So we can now check this, we look at the labels, and it turns out in this case, actually, bin B is well calibrated. Out of 10, really 7 are positive, but bin C is not well calibrated. We have 8 instead of 9, which we would have expected, and in A, we have 4 instead of 5. And the way we analyze these classifiers are basically drawing this binning in a diagram, and it looks as follows. We compute the gap between what we really have and what we achieve. So in this case, we have 0.5, we have 1.5, we have 0.4. And then we draw a diagram like you see, like the one you see on the left, where we basically for each one of these spins, do you have a laser pointer? Does this work? No.
Cursor maybe?
Anyway, so for each one of these spins, the blue top basically is what the real probability of the person being positive is, and the red stuff on top is the gap. So the larger the gap, the worse classified we are. And in this case, actually, 2 of these spins are misclassified, and in fact, the classifier is overconfident. So on the very right, we have a 90% bin, but really the probability is just 80%, right? So it's not quite right. So the question is, how well calibrated are classifiers that we're using? And in particular, we are interested in deep neural networks that are now so popular. Turns out there's actually people who have already looked into this, and they're actually sitting right in front of me. This is actually Alex Nicolescu, who's right here, and Rich Caruana, also here in the front row. They looked into this in 2005, right, and wrote a paper and analyzed how well calibrated classifiers are. And they came to a great conclusion that neural networks are actually pretty classified. So they actually were one of the better algorithms. And one thing we did, we looked into this, and we reproduced these results, and they were totally right. So we took a neural network that was very popular at the time, that's the Linnet from Yann LeCun. And when you look at this, the data set, we trained it on Cypher 100. And if you look at these bars, they basically, there's a very, very small gap. So they're actually pretty well classified, so they're very well behaved. The interesting thing, however, is that if you now take more modern neural network architectures, like really deep networks, like in this case, you do a dense net, but if you also take a ResNet, etc., turns out the picture looks quite different. And in fact, these classifiers are really badly classified. In fact, they are notoriously overconfident. And you can see it here on the right, you basically have a big pink bar above every blue bar. That means each one of them, the classifier is way overconfident. Now, we are not the first to realize this. Many people have realized that neural networks are just overconfident, and what they're outputting are really not probabilities. They're numbers between 0 and 1, but they're not well calibrated. If they say this is the 0.9, 90% probability, this is class A, that really doesn't mean it's 90%. It just means it's pretty confident. So many people have actually, in the last couple of years, have proposed different architectures that are well calibrated, and that overcome these problems through clever Bayesian designs, etc. And one thing I would like to argue in this talk, and that I'm trying to convince you of, that actually the problem is quite simple. And because the problem is really, really simple, there's also a really simple fix. So despite these methods are really, really nice and really cool, as a practitioner, most of the time you actually get away with a really simple trick to overcome this. So if you just pay attention for the next 3 slides, then you learn a very cute little trick. Okay, so let's think about why are neural networks badly classified. And to do this, let's take a look at a typical training curve. So here what you see is the top line is the testing error, and the dotted line is the training error of, this is actually this dense net on Cypher 100. And one thing you notice that right in the middle, the training error goes down to 0. And we all are familiar with these curves, right? So the training error goes down to 0. But one thing that has happened that's kind of different than from 10 years ago, nowadays when the training error is 0, we are not overfitting. We keep going, right? We can keep training, and the testing error does not go up. And there's various reasons for this, in part because we are optimizing, we're now using SGD, and we have dropout and batch normalization, etc. So there's a big gap between the training error and the testing error, but we keep training for around 150 epochs. And this is something that's different from maybe 10 years ago. Now this is okay, right? We're not overfitting, why not do this? But this gap is a problem. And why is this gap a problem? Because the neural network learns in the training data set that it's always right? It has a training error of 0. So every single example it sees, it gets correct, right? And so you can't blame it for becoming overconfident, because every single time it sees an example, it knows exactly the answer, right? And this is essentially what's happening. Like during training, the error is much, much lower than during testing, so of course this becomes overconfident. We can look at this, we can actually discover this very easily. Instead of looking at the training error, we look at the negative log likelihood. So negative log likelihood is actually the loss function that we are minimizing. And here you see the negative log likelihood on the training data, that's the bottom line, goes down to 0, but the negative log likelihood on the test data shoots up. So we are overfitting. Right? This is a typical overfitting plot that we are used to, but just not in error. You're overfitting in negative log likelihood. Now, negative log likelihood goes up. There can be 2 reasons for this. The first reason is that we are now misclassifying data points. Well, that's not the case, right? We know that's not the case because the test error doesn't go up. So it must be the second reason, and the second reason is that we are becoming overconfident, right? The confidence is off. And this is exactly what's happening. So, ultimately, the effect is very simple, right? So, once the training error becomes too low, the neural network just increases its confidence every single iteration we are taking. And because that's happening independent of every class, there's also a very simple fix for this. Let me just explain this very easily. Here's a neural network. On the left, you kind of see there's all this mumbo jumbo of the neural network, and I just drew the last layer here for you. And the last layer outputs a bunch of numbers, and then what we're doing is basically normalizing these with a softmax. The softmax projects the prediction onto a probability vector, which is basically a point on the simplex. So what's happening is, as the training error goes down, there's a lot of pressure to increase the confidence, because you already got the sample right, but it would have been even better if you would have been more confident, because after all, you were right. So what's happening is, there's pressure to increase these numbers and move the point on the simplex closer towards the corners, right? How do you get to the corner? You only get to the corner in the limit, right? If you basically have infinitely large numbers. So there's a lot of pressure to make these numbers really, really large and become overconfident. Because this happens independent for every single sample, right? Because everything is right, so every time you see a sample, you just try to increase the confidence, it's all roughly the same, like for every single class, etc. So what we can actually do to fix this is just introduce a very simple scaling factor that just compensates for this effect. Right? So basically we know these numbers are just simply too large, so we just scale them down. So we introduce a simple factor, temperature number t, and we set this variable on the validation set. And this is, by the way, very similar to plot scaling that was invented in 1999. And if you now do this, he said that basically what you're doing is you're moving the prediction back to the interior of the simplex, and you're getting rid of this overconfidence. If you now evaluate this on a variety of data sets, you see exactly the effect that you're hoping for. You get beautiful calibration. So now we are back in the regime that Alex and Rich were 10 years ago, where they actually said neural networks really are well calibrated. That's still the case today. You just have to correct for this overconfidence that we are getting because we are training with 0 training error. And more details in our paper that we have on this. All right, so this is really good news, right? So I hope in this whole session today, you learned that interpretability is important. Also, I will argue something else later on today. And in the panel, and one thing, the minimum kind of interpretability would be a well-calibrated classifier. Well, what I hopefully just convinced you of that it's really, really easy to get well-calibrated classifiers, right? So why don't we always do it? Turns out there is a hidden side effect, and that's a somewhat subtle point, but it's very interesting. All right, so you just have to bear with me. I'm going to have 3 equations in my talk. I know it's late today, but it's next. All right, so let's go back to what we said about calibrated classifiers. Right, so classifier is calibrated. If I take my data, my test data, and bin it into different bins, where each bin is all the points that have this particular confidence value. And in this bin, the confidence value should be the same as the expected label, as the base rate. So, for example, here on the left, all the points in this bin are classified as 0.5 probability of being positive. The expected value should also be 0.5. All right. So one thing we can now do is we can essentially make the whole data set a bin and computing the expected value of the confidence overall. And what we get in this case, that's right. Okay, sorry. So if we do this, we get the following, that if we take the whole data set as a bin, then we must actually get the label, the expected label. Right? So that's just, exactly the same thing just for the whole data set. So that means that an expectation, my algorithm predicts that there's an 80% chance that a patient is sick. Well, if that's across the whole population, then that's only well calibrated if actually in reality, the base rate is 80% chance that you will be sick. Alright? So in some sense, if I just sum up all these bins, I get that the expected confidence should be the same as the expected label. Alright. I can write the expected confidence, however, also in a different way. I can just decompose it. And I can say, alright, let's look at the expected confidence in two different ways. I can look at the confidence that I get for those people who have a label 0, who are healthy. And I can compute the confidence for those people who are sick. Alright, so these are my two terms here. I just weigh it by that probability. This is just algebra. There's nothing fancy. And I can equate these two. So now I get a very simple equation. Alright, why not? But this actually has profound implications. And why is this? Because if you look at these terms very, very closely, you realize that the first term is actually the false positive rate. This is the expected confidence, the confidence of being positive for all the points that are negative. Right? So it's a probability that my classifier says, I say you are sick, despite the fact that you are really not sick. Okay? So this is a false positive. Alright? So this is exactly my false positive rate. And the other term is the 1 minus false negative rate. This is saying the patient is actually healthy. What's the probability that I'm actually classifying this person as healthy? Well, if I take the 1 minus of this, I get the false negative. Alright? What's interesting about this equation, it basically incorporates the false positive rate and the false negative rate, and everything else is a constant. Everything else is a constant that's only determined by the data. So what does that mean? That means that the false positive rate and the false negative rate are in a linear relation with each other. Okay, so if my classifier is well calibrated, then what I'm telling you, and this is a result actually that comes from John Kleinberg and his group, that if I now have a classifier, usually the false positive rate and the false negative rate could vary in various ways. The moment the classifier is calibrated, that's no longer true. The false positive rate is a function of the false negative rate. If you give me the false negative rate, I can compute the false positive rate. They have to line on a line. And you see this blue line and this triangle? That's the whole set of possible classifiers. Every single classifier has to basically, fixes the false positive rate and the false negative rate. Now, all right, I know what you're thinking, big deal, right? Who cares, right? Well, it turns out actually, this is a severe limitation. Let me go back to my original example. So we had these data, these test samples, and we tried to predict, is a person sick or not? Okay, and so this is a well-calibrated classifier, and here we have all the points that have a 0.7, 70% chance of being sick, and it turns out of those, 70% really are sick, so we are happy. But if you look closely, actually there's something going on. This data set is actually, there's two types of patients. They're actually males and females. And if you look closer, we can actually do this spinning for males and females independently. And then actually in this particular case, the classifier is not calibrated. Right? So it turns out in this case, actually, amongst the males, only 2, so only 80% are positive. 80% are positive despite we want it to be 70. And females, actually, 60% are positive, but we want it 70. So on average, it's calibrated, but given that the patient is a male, or given that the patient is a female, it's not calibrated. That would be a problem. Why would that be a problem? Because if the doctor sees this and gets the risk assessment, the output of the risk assessment tool, he or she would then make a different decision based on your gender. Right? So if it actually gets a 70 probability of you being sick, but then actually, well, you're a male, so therefore actually it's probably just 80, so I'm going to do a different treatment than if you were female. This is even, that this is problematic, maybe even more obvious if you think about, for example, risk assessment tools when you give out loans, or something that has become very popular lately. Popular discussion is courts of law in the United States have started using risk assessment tools to predict if someone should be released out of prison or should be, be left, should get bail. And here the risk you're trying to assess is, will the person commit future crimes, right? And what you really don't want is that, the person that gets the judge gets the output of the risk assessment tools and says, okay, you have a 90% chance of not committing a crime, but because you're a member of a certain race or a certain gender, I actually still, keep you in prison or something. That would be inherently unfair and highly problematic. So that's something that's, has big ethical implications. So what we need to have is that the classifier is calibrated for each group. So we call that group-wise calibration. So in other words, basically you have to fix it, that for men, it really says 80% for this whole bin. And the reason is because the answer really is 80%. If you're in that bin, the chance of being sick or chance of committing future crimes is 80%. So that's the right answer. And for women, it's 60%. All right, but when we do this, we've actually just changed something. We changed something fundamental. We now actually have two different classifiers, right? Because we have two different data sets. And what does that mean? That means that these two different classifiers lie on different lines. Earlier on I told you that when a classifier is calibrated, right, the false positive and false negative rate lie on a line. And this line is, the slope of that line is determined by the base rate of the group. So now we have two different groups and they are on different lines. And when we have two classifiers, they will be points on these lines. Now why is that problematic? It's problematic for the following reason, that we now have these two classifiers. Imagine these two points. One is trained from, one is for men, one is for women, and they're as good as it gets, right? We took the latest deep net and we put up all our brain power. We got amazing classifiers. This is the lowest error we could do. The problem is that we inherently have a different false positive rate and a different false negative rate across the two groups. And that's really, really problematic because it means you will make different mistakes based on your gender, right? Or if you're in court and we decide if you will, allowed to go out on bail, right? We make different mistakes based on your race, right? Members of one race will accidentally be left out, or be allowed out, although they will commit future crimes, and members of another race will be locked up despite that they won't commit future crimes, right? This is highly problematic. The only way to have the same false positive, false negatives rate would be if the 2 points actually meet exactly the origin, because that's the only point where these two lines intersect, right? So that basically means that both classifiers are perfect. So in the trivial case, where both classifiers are perfect, then of course it's not a problem because you make no false positives and you make no false negatives. You have zero training error. But the moment you make mistakes, if you have group-wise calibration, you will have different false positives and different false negatives rate. And this is actually exactly what happened. So there was lately, a big complaint by ProPublica about this risk assessment tool Compass that is used in the United States, and it was determined that basically, it was unfair and basically was more likely to put African Americans back into prison than Caucasians. This was also formally proven by John Kleinberg et al. That these three groups, like group-wise calibration, the same false negative rate and false positive rate, are at odds with each other. So one thing you can say, all right, so maybe we're trying to bite off too much, right? So maybe we can't have all three of those. Maybe we just relax one of them. So maybe we say, okay, we want to have calibration because otherwise we can't interpret the result. But maybe it's okay if we just have one of them. So we just say the false negative rate has to match. And in some applications, maybe that's okay. That's all right? Then basically you can see this, this line here intersects the blue line and the red line, so that's theoretically feasible. The same if you just want the false positive or the false negative rate to match. Or you could have a linear combination of those two, right? So theoretically, that should be possible. And it turns out you can actually achieve this. So if you have basically different groups and you want to have well-calibrated classifiers, you're allowed to have one more constraint on your false positive and false negative rate, trying to make your classifier fair. And let me just show you how to do it. And I said earlier on, it's a negative result. And what I will show you now is a really unsatisfying algorithm that I don't like and my co-authors don't like. Nobody likes it. And unfortunately, it's optimal. So here's the following scenario. So we have two classifiers, and we trained them as well as we could. These are the two dots on these two lines. So again, for these two groups, like every classifier is somewhere on this line, and the closer you're to the origin, the fewer mistakes you make. So we would like to have this to be fair. Currently, it's not fair. The false positive rate is lower for man, in this case the blue group, than the red group. So how do we get the classifier that matches the false positive rate? And there's a very simple algorithm. It works as follows. We take the original classifier that we have, and that's the best classifier we could get. And then we take a trivial classifier. And the trivial classifier is this one here, which basically has the highest error. It just says we just toss a coin with the base rate, right? So if you say you have an 80% chance of being sick, you just toss a coin with 80%, we say you're sick, and 20% we say you're not. That's a terrible classifier. That makes no sense. That's as bad as it gets. And now we interpolate between these two. So what we do is we toss a coin, and if it's heads, then we pick this terrible classifier, and if it's tails, we pick the best classifier that we have. And so this way, we basically make additional errors to match the false positive rate between the two groups. As I said, that's very, very unsatisfactory, and I hope that will not be used to make decisions about loans, etc. The sad thing, and that's what we show in the paper, that it's actually an optimal algorithm, and you can't actually do any better. So even if people come up with different algorithms, it's likely actually even worse. If you're not depressed enough, I have one more depressing slide. We actually went to the data set that actually people, of this compass algorithm, where people were let out of prison based on a risk assessment tool, and the question was, will they commit future crimes, yes or no? And here actually the true data, where you actually, the blue and red line are two different races, and you see that the false positive and false negative rate vary a lot. In this case, in fact, they vary so much that if you look at the red line, you could actually not move the red line to the false positive rate of the blue line. Right? So the discrepancy is so large that even with this terrible algorithm of just adding coin tosses and making worse predictions, you're actually still doing worse than you would do for the other race. So anyway, on that downer, let me conclude. So I made a couple of points today. The first one is that calibration is really, really important. Right? So if you make decisions and you want to read the output of a classifier, you need well-calibrated classifiers. The good news is that, especially for deep nets, we can actually make them very easily well-calibrated. They are not calibrated out of the box. If you just train them, they are horribly calibrated. But if you just rescale the layer before the softmax with a single constant, that takes you milliseconds, and you set that parameter on the validation set, you actually get very well-calibrated classifiers. Because the reason for the calibration is very simple, the miscalibration is very simple. So it's just temperature rescaling. And finally, calibration has side effects. And if you have group-wise calibration, which is usually what you want, then that implies that group-wise calibration is at odds with the definitions of fairness, that you actually want to make the same kind of mistakes across different days. Finally, I want to thank my co-authors, especially Manish Raghavan and Jeff Blythe and Tron, who did most of the work, and Jeff especially, who actually made these slides for me. Thanks, Jeff. And finally, I also want to say we are hiring at Cornell. I'm looking for postdocs. If you're interested in these kind of issues, please contact me. And we are also hiring tenure track in Ithaca and in New York Tech. All right, thank you.
I'm very sorry we don't actually have time for questions. but we will have Kool-Aid with poison in it at the next break for anyone who has decided they just can't continue. So, but let's thank Kilian again for a great talk.